When we read the accounts of the crucifixion, there is a natural tendency to rush toward the cross. We focus on the heavy wooden beam. We hear the shouting of the Jerusalem crowd. We picture the Roman soldiers, the iron nails, and the dark sky. The sheer emotional weight of the moment pulls our attention entirely toward the suffering of Jesus. But right before the hammering begins, the gospel writers do something unusual. They slow the narrative down. They pause the chaotic motion of the execution to give us a very specific detail, a name. Matthew chapter 27, verse 33 says this, "And when they came to a place called Golgotha, which means place of a skull," Mark chapter 15, verse 22 says almost the exact same thing. "And they brought him to the place called Golgotha," which means place of a skull. John chapter 19, verse 17 repeats it again. "He went out, bearing his own cross, to the place called the place of a skull," which in Aramaic is called Golgotha. Notice what is happening here. These accounts were written in Greek. The authors are communicating to a wide audience across the ancient world. But in this specific moment, 3 different writers stopped their Greek narrative to insert a harsh, guttural Aramaic word, Golgotha. And then they immediately translate it for their readers, so the meaning is not lost. The place of a skull. When a biblical writer leaves an original, foreign word in the text and then pauses to explain it, they are putting up a massive signpost. They are telling the reader to pay close attention. They did not have to do this. They could have simply written that Jesus was taken outside the city walls to the Roman execution site, but they wanted that specific Aramaic word to ring in our ears. For centuries, modern readers have treated this detail like a simple piece of historical trivia. We assume it is just a GPS coordinate, a spot on a map outside the gates of 1st century Jerusalem, a convenient, elevated hill for the empire to do its brutal work. People often assume the hill was called this because the rock formations looked like a human face, or perhaps because it was a common site of public execution, a desolate place associated with the bones of the dead. Those historical realities might be true, but in the biblical narrative, geography is almost never just geography. Geography is theology. To the original Jewish readers, names were never accidental. A name carried identity. A name carried history. When an event happened at a specific place, the biblical authors expected the reader to remember everything else that had ever happened on a mountain, in a wilderness, or in a valley. The setting was part of the message. Scripture does not waste words. The gospel writers are not merely giving us directions to a historical site. They are introducing the final stage of a massive, quiet, biblical pattern. The crucifixion of Jesus of Nazareth is the most widely known event in human history. But because we are so familiar with the story, we often miss the careful architecture underneath it. We look at Golgotha and see only an ending. The gospel writers look at Golgotha and see a deliberate fulfillment. To understand what is actually happening on that Friday afternoon, we cannot just look at the cross. We have to look at the ground it is planted in. We have to understand why the ultimate place of death, the literal place of the skull, was chosen to become the throne of a new kingdom. But to see how that transformation happens, we have to strip away some of our modern assumptions. We have to look at the translation of the word itself, because the way we usually sing and talk about this location today actually hides the brutal, specific image the text wants us to confront. If you grew up around the Christian tradition, you know the name of the hill where Jesus died. You have probably sung hymns about it. You have seen churches named after it. But when you picture that hill, you probably do not use the Aramaic word Golgotha. You use the word Calvary. Calvary is a beautiful word. It sounds poetic. It feels reverent. But Calvary is not an Aramaic word, and it is not a Greek word. To understand what the biblical text is actually doing, we have to look at how that word entered our vocabulary and how it has accidentally softened the narrative. As we saw in the 1st century accounts, the original name of the location was Golgotha. When the gospel writers translated that Aramaic word into Greek for their readers, they used the word cranion. It is the exact word we use today when we talk about the human cranium. It literally means a skull. For nearly 400 years, early Christians read the Gospels in Greek and confronted that stark, brutal word, cranion, the skull. But in the late 4th century, a scholar named Jerome translated the entire Bible into Latin. When Jerome reached the word cranion, he used the Latin equivalent. The Latin word for skull is Calvaria. When the Bible was eventually translated into English, translators carried that Latin word over, shaping it into the English word Calvary. Over centuries of church history, Calvary became a theological sanctuary. It became a shorthand for grace, forgiveness, and atonement. We name hospitals, universities, and chapels after it. We have smoothed the edges of the word until it feels safe. But the original authors did not write a safe word. They did not want us to imagine a peaceful, poetic hillside. They wanted us to look at a skull. In the biblical imagination, a skull is not just a piece of anatomy. It is the ultimate symbol of defilement. Under the law of Moses, human remains were deeply unclean. To touch a bone, a grave, or a corpse was to be separated from the worship of the community. Death was the great intruder. It was the final, devastating result of the rebellion in Eden. A skull is what remains when life has been entirely defeated. It is the visual proof of the curse. By forcing the reader to translate Golgotha into the place of a skull, the gospel writers are drawing a theological map. They are telling us exactly where the cross is being planted. It is not just being planted into dirt. It is being planted directly into the center of the human curse. Jesus is being taken outside the holy city, away from the temple, and lifted up in the place of absolute defilement. He is entering the territory of death. For many modern readers, the name is simply explained by the geography. We are told that the hill must have looked like a skull. Perhaps the limestone rock formations had hollowed out caves that resembled eye sockets. That is entirely possible, and it fits the stark landscape of the region. But the earliest Christians did not think the name was just about the shape of the rocks. When you read the writings of the early church, a completely different explanation emerges. They believed the name was not describing what the hill looked like. They believed the name was describing what was buried underneath it. And that ancient tradition opens up one of the most profound theological mysteries of the crucifixion. When you read the ancient Christian writers, a startling idea begins to appear. Men like Origen, writing in the 3rd century, and Athanasius in the 4th century, recorded a deep tradition about the hill of Golgotha. They did not believe the name referred to the shape of the rocks, and they did not believe it referred to the scattered bones of random criminals. They believed it was called the place of a skull because of one specific skull, the skull of Adam. According to this early Jewish and Christian tradition, the bones of the very first man were buried exactly where the cross was planted. Now, we must be careful here. The biblical text itself does not say this directly. There is no historical or archaeological proof that Adam was buried outside the walls of 1st century Jerusalem. But we need to understand why the early church held on to this tradition so tightly. They were not just guessing at history. They were reading the geography through the lens of theology. They were reading the gospel accounts alongside the letters of the Apostle Paul. In the book of Romans, chapter 5, Paul builds a massive framework to explain what Jesus is doing. He calls Jesus the second Adam. Paul writes that through the first Adam, sin and death entered the world. The first Adam rebelled in a garden, brought a curse upon humanity, and returned to the dust. But Jesus, the second Adam, comes to undo the devastation of the first. Through the obedience of the second Adam, life and justification enter the world. The early Christians took this profound theology and attached it to the physical ground of Golgotha. Imagine the visual they saw. The cross of the second Adam, planted directly over the skull of the first Adam. They believed that when Jesus was crucified, his blood ran down the wood of the cross, sank into the earth, and touched the ancient bones of the man who first brought death into the world. It is a breathtaking image. The instrument of death becomes the mechanism of life. The blood of the new covenant reaches all the way down to the root of the human curse. Whether this was geographically accurate did not matter to them as much as the ultimate truth it conveyed. The tradition of Adam's skull reveals exactly how the early Christians understood the cross. It was not just a Roman execution. It was a cosmic reversal. Jesus was confronting the grave on its own territory. He was standing exactly where the curse was heaviest. The Gospel writers wanted the reader to look at the place of a skull and realize that the long reign of human mortality was finally being challenged. The ground of defilement was becoming the ground of redemption. But while the early Christians were looking at the theology of the ground, the Roman Empire was looking at something very different. The empire did not care about the first Adam. They did not care about biblical patterns, ancient Jewish history, or theological poetry. Rome chose this specific location for a very practical, terrifying reason. And understanding the brutal logic of the Roman executioners reveals the next layer of what is happening on this hill. Because before Golgotha was a theological symbol, it was an imperial warning sign. While the early Christian imagination was focused on the profound theology buried in the earth, the Roman Empire was focused strictly on the surface. Rome did not care about the first Adam. They did not study the prophecies of Isaiah or the patterns of Genesis. When the Roman governor, Pontius Pilate, authorized the execution of Jesus, he was not trying to fulfill Jewish scripture. He was trying to maintain order in a volatile province. And to maintain order, Rome relied on a very specific, carefully engineered tool of psychological warfare. We often think of crucifixion simply as a method of capital punishment. It was not just execution. It was a public billboard. The empire designed the cross to do more than end a human life. It was engineered to strip away all dignity, all identity, and all hope. It was the ultimate display of state terror. It was Rome's way of saying that they owned not only the land, but the bodies of the people living on it. This is why the geography of Golgotha is so historically important. When we picture the crucifixion today, we usually imagine a lonely, quiet hill, far away from the city, silhouetted against the sky. But that image is a product of later paintings, not first-century history. The Romans did not hide their executions. They put them on full display. Golgotha was located just outside the city walls, but it was not hidden in a remote valley. Executions in the Roman world were placed directly along major thoroughfares. They were positioned near the main gates, on the busy roads where travelers, merchants, and pilgrims had to walk. The crosses were not always towering structures high in the air. Often, the victims were suspended just a few feet off the ground, right at eye level with the people passing by. The Gospel writers tell us that people were walking past Jesus, shaking their heads and mocking him. They were close enough to read the sign above his head. They were close enough to hear him speak. Rome chose this specific location to make a statement, and the timing made the statement even louder. It was Passover. Thousands of Jewish pilgrims were crowding into Jerusalem to celebrate their ancient liberation from Egypt. The atmosphere in the city was always tense during this festival. The memory of freedom was in the air, so Rome deliberately positioned their execution site right where the incoming crowds would have to look at it. The place of a skull was not just a piece of geography. It was a border checkpoint. It was the empire's warning sign. Rome was forcing every pilgrim to look at the cross and remember who was actually in charge. The message was impossible to misunderstand. Rebellion brings the curse. Caesar is the only true king. Every detail of the execution at Golgotha was designed to reinforce that message. The stripping of the garments, the public beating, the elevation on the wood. It was all meant to be the ultimate humiliation of anyone who claimed royal authority outside of Rome. But this is where the gospel narrative begins to do something brilliant. The biblical authors record all of these brutal, historical facts. They do not soften the horror of the Roman execution. But as they write, they slowly reveal that the exact methods Rome used to humiliate Jesus were actually serving a much deeper purpose. Rome chose this specific place to make a statement about who held the power. But the writers show us that God was using the exact same location to make a very different announcement. Because, in the biblical imagination, God's most decisive actions do not happen on random patches of dirt. They happen on mountains. And Golgotha, the hill of execution, was about to become the final mountain in a pattern that stretches all the way back to the beginning of the Bible. In the biblical imagination, a mountain is never just a pile of rocks. It is the architecture of revelation. Throughout Scripture, whenever heaven wants to intersect with earth, the meeting place is almost always elevated. Eden is described by the prophets as the holy mountain of God. Sinai is the mountain of fire and covenant. Zion is the mountain of the King. Mountains are the sacred spaces where humanity climbs up and where God steps down. And there is one specific mountain in the Hebrew Scriptures that sets the exact blueprint for what is happening at Golgotha. In Genesis chapter 22, God gives Abraham an agonizing command. He tells him to take his son, his only son, the one he loves, and offer him as a sacrifice. The location God chooses for this is not random. He tells Abraham to go to the region of Moriah, to a specific mountain that will be shown to him. As they approach the hill, the text gives us a profound detail. Abraham takes the wood for the offering and places it on the back of his son, Isaac. The son carries the wood of his own sacrifice up the mountain. As they walk, Isaac asks a haunting question. He sees the fire and the wood, but he asks his father, "Where is the lamb?" Abraham answers that God himself will provide the lamb. And on top of Mount Moriah, God does. Isaac is spared. A ram is found caught in a thicket by its horns, and it becomes the substitute. That ancient moment was not just a historical test. It was a shadow. It was an incomplete pattern, waiting for its final fulfillment. Centuries later, Jewish tradition closely linked the region of Moriah to the very hills where Jerusalem was built. The temple itself stood on this elevated ridge, a place of constant sacrifice. And just outside the walls of that same city, in that same region, another father is leading his only beloved son up a hill. Once again, the son is carrying the wood of his own sacrifice on his back. But this time, the pattern reaches its devastating conclusion. On Golgotha, there is no voice from heaven telling the executioners to stop. The son is not spared, because the true lamb that Abraham promised has finally arrived. And just like the substitute on Mount Moriah, this lamb also has his head caught in a thicket of thorns. When you place Genesis 22 and the gospel accounts side by side, the theology of the ground begins to shift. Golgotha is not an interruption of God's plan. It is the culmination of it. The Roman Empire thought they were just using a convenient roadside hill to execute a Jewish rabbi. They did not realize they had stumbled into a story that was written thousands of years before their empire even existed. They were carrying out the brutal law of Rome, but they were simultaneously fulfilling the deep architecture of redemption. God was taking the empire's place of death and transforming it into the ultimate mountain of provision. Pause for a second and look at the progression, the place of defilement, the burial ground of the curse, the Roman warning sign, and now, the final mountain of sacrifice. But if you were standing in the crowd on that Friday afternoon, it would not have looked like a divine fulfillment. It would not have looked like a cosmic victory. Golgotha is the final mountain in the biblical pattern, but what happens on this mountain looks completely backwards. Instead of glory, there is blood. Instead of a coronation, there is a brutal execution. It looks like the definitive end of anyone who dared to claim authority outside of Caesar. Until you look closely at the top of the wooden beam, because in the middle of all this intentional humiliation, the gospel writers want us to read the sign that Pilate ordered to be nailed directly above his head. When a Roman execution squad crucified a criminal, they often carried a wooden placard ahead of him through the streets. In Latin, it was called a titulus. Its purpose was simple and brutal. It listed the name of the condemned and the specific crime that brought him to the cross. It was the empire's way of keeping the public record clear. It was a warning to anyone watching. But when we look at the sign nailed above Jesus on Golgotha, something completely unexpected happens. The Gospel of John, in chapter 19, slows down the narrative to give us the exact wording. Pilate wrote a title and put it on the cross. It read, "Jesus of Nazareth, the King of the Jews." The chief priests immediately saw the problem. They rushed to the Roman governor and demanded a correction. They said, "Do not write the King of the Jews, but rather, this man said, 'I am King of the Jews.'" It was a vital distinction. One was a claim of treason made by a madman. The other was a statement of official fact. But Pilate, perhaps out of sheer stubbornness or a desire to irritate the religious leaders, refused to change a single letter. He answered, "What I have written, I have written." Pilate meant the sign as a brutal, public insult. He was using the bruised and bleeding man on the wood to humiliate the entire Jewish nation. He was saying, "Here is your mighty deliverer. Here is what Rome does to your hopes." But the gospel writers recognized that a massive, divine irony was unfolding. God often takes the mockery of human empires and turns it into absolute truth. Pilate thought he was writing a sarcastic death warrant. He did not realize he was writing an eternal royal decree. Look closely at the details John provides. He tells us that the sign was written in 3 languages: Aramaic, Latin, and Greek. This is not just a passing historical note. In the ancient world, when a new emperor took the throne, his ascension was announced across the empire in the major languages of the people. It was a universal declaration of sovereignty. By nailing that multilingual sign to the wood, Pilate accidentally became the first imperial herald of the gospel. He officially proclaimed the kingship of Jesus of Nazareth to the religious world of Aramaic, the political world of Latin, and the cultural world of Greek. The whole earth was being put on notice. John is showing us that Rome is not merely conducting an execution. They are accidentally conducting a coronation. The place of a skull is being transformed, right in front of the mocking crowds, into a royal pavilion. The Romans elevated Jesus on the cross so that people could look down on him with disgust. But in the biblical pattern, the true king is always elevated before his people. The cross is no longer just an instrument of state terror. It is being reframed as a throne. Pilate wrote the truest sentence in human history, and he nailed it exactly where it belonged. But the proclamation of the sign is only one piece of this royal pattern. Because if the cross is a throne, and the sign is the official decree, then the rest of the dark events on Golgotha suddenly shift in meaning. The soldiers thought they were just torturing a political prisoner. But every single thing they did to humiliate him was actually fulfilling the exact requirements of a king taking his seat of power. The sign Pilate nailed to the cross was the official decree. But in the ancient world, a royal decree was only one part of the protocol. When a new king or emperor took his seat of power, there was a specific, recognizable sequence of events. There was the gathering of the imperial guard. There was the draping of royal colors. There was the placement of a crown. There was the handing over of a scepter. And finally, there was the public elevation, where the ruler was lifted up for the people to see and acknowledge. If you read the execution accounts strictly through the lens of Roman history, the soldiers are simply acting out a dark, twisted joke. They gather the battalion inside the governor's headquarters. They strip Jesus and drape him in a purple robe, the undisputed color of imperial authority. They weave a makeshift crown and press it onto his head. They place a reed in his right hand to mock a king's scepter. They kneel before him and shout, "Hail, King of the Jews." They think they are participating in a parody, but the biblical narrative is operating on a much higher frequency. The gospel writers are showing us that these unseeing soldiers are accidentally carrying out the exact formal protocol of a royal coronation. Notice the profound detail of the crown. It is not made of gold, and it is not woven from Roman laurel leaves. It is made of thorns. This is not a random instrument of torture. If you go all the way back to the opening pages of Scripture, in the 3rd chapter of Genesis, thorns are the direct, physical result of the rebellion in Eden. When the first Adam broke the covenant, the ground was cursed, and God said it would now bring forth thorns and thistles. Thorns are the visible, tangible manifestation of the human curse. And now, the Roman soldiers take the literal symbol of that ancient curse twist it into a circle, and place it directly onto the head of the second Adam. He is wearing the curse of the world as his royal crown. Then comes the final step of the protocol. The king must take his seat. He must be elevated. In the theology of the Gospel of John, the cross is never described simply as a place of humiliation. Jesus repeatedly speaks of being lifted up. It is a phrase that carries a deliberate double meaning. It means to be physically hoisted onto a wooden beam, to die. But it is also the exact language used for someone being exalted, highly honored, and lifted onto a throne. The cross is the throne of the crucified king. This is the shocking reversal of Golgotha. Jesus is lifted up at the place of a skull. He is positioned directly over the ultimate symbol of human defilement and mortality. But he does not take his throne by dealing death to his enemies. He takes his throne by absorbing the death of his enemies into himself. The wood of the cross is planted deep into the territory of the grave, and the true king is seated above it. The crushing weight of the Roman Empire, the mocking of the crowds, and the ancient curse of Genesis are all colliding on this one specific hill, and the king simply takes it all. This is why the gospel writers refused to let us look away from the Aramaic name of this location. They wanted us to see the skull beneath the cross. They wanted us to realize that the ground of execution was being entirely repurposed. Golgotha was not the place where the true king was defeated. It was the place where he was crowned. But the theological map of this location is not quite complete. We have seen the mountain, the throne, and the skull. But the Gospel of John adds one final, quiet detail before the sun sets on that Friday afternoon. It is a detail about the exact geography immediately surrounding the cross, and it brings the entire biblical pattern to a stunning, beautiful conclusion. We have traced the pattern of the mountain. We have seen the exact protocol of the throne. But to see the final, breathtaking layer of what happens at Golgotha, we have to look at the ground one last time. The Gospel writers did not just tell us about the hill. The Gospel of John gives us one more geographical detail. It is a detail that feels completely out of place in a Roman execution narrative. John chapter 19, verse 41 says this: "Now in the place where he was crucified there was a garden, and in the garden a new tomb, in which no one had yet been laid." Read that sentence carefully. In the place where he was crucified, there was a garden. Historically, this makes perfect sense. The limestone rock formations outside Jerusalem often had patches of cultivated soil where wealthy citizens built their family tombs. But in the biblical imagination, geography is never just geography. Geography is theology. And this specific location brings the entire scriptural story full circle. Remember the ancient tradition we looked at earlier. The early Christians believed that Golgotha was the burial place of Adam. They saw the second Adam standing directly over the curse of the first. But where did the story of the first Adam begin? It began in a garden. The first Adam rebelled in a garden, brought thorns from the ground, and was sent out into the wilderness of death. Now, the second Adam takes those literal thorns upon his head, steps into the absolute center of death, and transforms the place of the skull back into a garden. The proximity is not an accident. The place of execution and the garden of new creation are sharing the exact same soil. This is why, 3 days later, when Mary Magdalene comes to the empty tomb, she sees the risen Jesus, but she does not recognize him. John chapter 20, verse 15, tells us exactly what she thought. "Supposing him to be the gardener," she said to him. For centuries, people have read that detail as a simple case of mistaken identity. It was early in the morning. She was weeping. Her vision was blurred. But the Gospel of John is doing something much deeper. Mary was not making a mistake. She was accidentally speaking the deepest theological truth of the morning. He is the gardener. He is the second Adam, standing in the new Eden, beginning the work of new creation on the exact same ground where the old creation fell apart. This is the full architecture of Golgotha. We started with a harsh, guttural Aramaic word that most readers simply pass over. We saw how centuries of English translation softened it into Calvary, hiding the brutal image of the skull. We saw the Roman warning sign, the empire's desperate attempt to show who held the power. But underneath all of it, God was operating on a completely different level. He took the place of defilement and made it the final mountain of sacrifice. He took the Roman mockery and turned it into an eternal coronation. He took the curse of the thorns and made it a royal crown. And he took the place of the skull and planted a garden right beside it. When you understand the biblical pattern, you realize that the writers did not leave the Aramaic name in the text just to give us directions. They wanted us to look at the absolute worst the world could offer, the place of death, the skull, because they wanted us to know that there is no place so ruined, no ground so cursed, and no situation so deeply defiled that the king cannot step into it and bring it back to life. If this study has helped you see Scripture with fresh eyes, consider subscribing so you do not miss the next deep dive into the Word. The name Golgotha was never just a spot on a map. It was the quiet announcement that the reign of death was over.